Tonight we're going to San Francisco, California, 1974. A city that had become, for one community, the closest thing to a promised land that existed anywhere in America. Gay men were arriving from every state in the country, drawn by the promise of a neighborhood where they could live openly for the first time in their lives. The Castro district was filling with camera shops and bookstores and bars with plate glass windows that didn't hide what was inside. For the first time, a community that had spent decades in the shadows was building something visible. But the laws had not caught up with the culture. Sodomy was still a criminal offense. Police still raided the bars. And the men who gathered in those neighborhoods, who met in late-night diners and left together for the dunes along Ocean Beach, were doing so in a space that the rest of the city refused to see or protect. Over the course of 18 months, at least 6 men were stabbed to death and left on beaches and in parks along the western edge of the city. 3 more were attacked and survived. The victims were all white, all male, and all gay or suspected to be gay. They had been met at bars and restaurants by a young man who flattered them by sketching their portraits on cocktail napkins before luring them somewhere private. Police identified a suspect. A psychologist reported that the man had confessed during therapy. 3 survivors picked him out of a lineup. And none of them would testify, because doing so would have meant publicly identifying themselves as gay, and in 1975, that was a destruction they feared more than the man who had tried to kill them. The suspect was never charged. He is believed to be alive today, living freely in the Bay Area, more than 50 years after the last body was found face up in the sand. Sit back and listen to the story of the Doodler murders. San Francisco in 1974 was not one city. It was several, layered on top of each other, sharing the same streets but operating under entirely different rules. There was the San Francisco of the old Irish families and the Italian fishermen, of the financial district and the shipyards, of the Catholic churches and the police precincts staffed almost entirely by men who had grown up within a few miles of where they now worked. And then there was the other San Francisco, the one that had been building itself, neighborhood by neighborhood, since the late 1960s. Gay men had been arriving in the city for years, drawn first to the Tenderloin and Polk Street, and then, as the 1970s began, to the Castro district on the southern slope of Twin Peaks. They came from small towns in the Midwest, from military bases where they had hidden themselves for years, from families that had told them they were sick or sinful or broken. They came because they had heard that San Francisco was the one place in America where a man could live openly and not be destroyed for it. By 1974, the Castro was transforming. The working-class Irish families who had lived there for decades were selling their Victorian homes and moving to the suburbs, and gay men were buying those homes and opening businesses in the storefronts below. Camera shops and bookstores and cafes appeared on Castro Street. The Twin Peaks Tavern, which had opened in 1972, became the first gay bar in the country with full-length plate glass windows facing the street, a declaration that the men inside had nothing to hide. Harvey Milk had opened his camera shop on Castro Street the year before. He was not yet a politician, not yet the first openly gay man elected to public office in California, but he was already a presence in the neighborhood, loud, theatrical, and unapologetic. He would later estimate that San Francisco was home to roughly 85,000 gay men. Up to 25% of them, he believed, were still closeted. That figure, 1 in 4, is essential to understanding what happened next. Because for all the freedom the Castro represented, the reality of being gay in San Francisco in 1974 was more complicated and more dangerous than the neighborhood's bright storefronts suggested. Sodomy was still a criminal offense under California law. It would not be repealed until 1976. A man could be arrested for having sex with another man in his own home. Cross-dressing was technically illegal, and the San Francisco Police Department enforced these laws with enthusiasm. Officers conducted entrapment operations in Golden Gate Park, where plainclothes cops would pose as gay men, invite in advance, and then make an arrest. In at least one documented case, 2 officers dragged a man from his car after a minor traffic stop and beat him so severely he suffered brain damage. Neither officer was charged. The department's director of personnel stated publicly that gay men were of bad moral character and that the SFPD would never knowingly hire one. The department's director of public relations called gay men emotionally unstable. The statement was retracted only after Harvey Milk publicly denounced it. This was the institution that was supposed to protect the men of the Castro. The result was predictable. The gay community in San Francisco developed a deep and rational distrust of the police. Crimes against gay men went unreported because reporting them meant identifying yourself to an institution that considered your existence a criminal offense. Assaults went uninvestigated. Murders were treated as low-priority cases if they were investigated at all. And so the community protected itself in the ways it could. Bartenders kept mental notes on the men who came through their doors. Regulars watched out for strangers who seemed wrong. Word of mouth moved through the bars faster than any police bulletin ever could. But there were limits to what a community could do when the institutions meant to protect it had decided it was not worth protecting. And there were places where that community was especially vulnerable. The bars closed at 2 in the morning. After that, men who had met inside would leave together, sometimes to an apartment, sometimes to a diner for a late meal, and sometimes to the places along the western edge of the city where privacy could be found in the dark. Ocean Beach stretched for miles along San Francisco's Pacific coast. The sand dunes rose high enough to block the view from the road. The sound of the surf covered everything. Land's End, just to the north, was a rocky stretch of coastline with trails that wound through dense brush and ended at hidden overlooks above the water. Lincoln Park, further inland, offered its own cover, trees, golf course terrain, isolation. These were the places where men went when they wanted to be alone together. They were also the places where, if something went wrong, no one would hear. And in January of 1974, something went terribly wrong. At 1:57 in the morning on the 27th of January, 1974, a body was found at the water's edge on Ocean Beach. Gerald Earl Kavanagh was 49 years old. He was a Canadian immigrant who had served in the United States Army during the Second World War. He worked in a mattress factory. He was Catholic. He had never married. He lived alone in the Haight-Ashbury district, and he visited his mother once a year, but his family did not know he was gay. His body was lying face up in the sand, fully clothed, close enough to the waterline that the tide had nearly carried him out to sea. He had been stabbed multiple times in the front and in the back. His left hand showed defensive wounds, which meant he had been conscious when the attack began and had tried to fight back. In his pocket was $21.12. On his wrist was a Timex watch. He was 5'8" and weighed 220 pounds. No one knew who he was at first. The medical examiner listed him as John Doe number 7. It took time to identify him because he was unmarried and had few connections in the city. His murder was not widely reported in the local newspapers, and 5 months simply passed. On the 25th of June, 1974, a woman walking along Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park came upon a body in the bushes. Joseph Stevens, known to his friends and audiences as Che, was 27 years old. He was a female impersonator and comedian who had been performing in San Francisco for 8 years. He was tall, 6'2", muscular, and by all accounts a magnetic presence both on and off the stage. His friends described him as charming, gregarious, and well-spoken in public, but shy and modest in private. He had come out when he was drafted into the military, and though his family struggled with it at first, they eventually accepted and celebrated him. He performed under the name Che, doing an impression of Julie Andrews that brought audiences to their feet. He had been seen the previous night at the Cabaret Club on Montgomery Street in North Beach. Police believed he had driven his killer to the park himself, which meant he had likely been alive and in conversation with the man who murdered him during the ride to Spreckles Lake. He had been stabbed multiple times. His face had been beaten so badly that his family could barely recognize him. The aftermath of Che Stevens' death extended far beyond the investigation. His sister Alma, consumed by grief, suffered a psychotic break 3 months later and killed their mother and another sister. She was institutionalized. The family never recovered. Less than 2 weeks after Stevens was found, on the 7th of July, a woman walking her dog on Ocean Beach discovered a third body. Klaus Achim Christman was 31 years old. He was a German national, an employee of Michelin, who had been staying with friends in San Francisco for 3 months. He was married with 2 children. He was not publicly known to be gay, though a makeup tube found in his pocket suggested to police what his family would only confirm decades later, that he had come to San Francisco in part to explore something about himself that he could not explore at home. He had last been seen at Bojangles, a club in the Tenderloin district. His body was found at the foot of Lincoln Way, near the same stretch of Ocean Beach where Gerald Kavanagh had been discovered 6 months earlier. He was fully clothed, his pants were unzipped, his throat had been slashed in 3 places, and he had been stabbed at least 15 times. The inspector who caught the case, David Toskai, a 20-year veteran of the homicide department who had also investigated the Zodiac murders, described it as one of the most vicious stabbings he had ever seen. After the 3rd murder, the police acknowledged publicly what had been circulating privately for weeks. The 3 killings were connected. The victims had all been men. They had all been found in or near areas known for clandestine gay encounters. They had all been stabbed in the front and the back in similar locations on the body, and they had all apparently met their killer shortly before their deaths in a social setting and gone with him willingly to the place where they were found. But acknowledging the connection did not produce momentum. The crime scenes were outdoors, exposed to the elements, offering almost no forensic evidence. There were no witnesses, there was no murder weapon, there was no suspect, and the city had other things on its mind. In 1974, San Francisco was experiencing a level of violent crime that made a handful of stabbings on the beach seem almost peripheral. The Zodiac killer, though inactive, had never been caught, and his presence still lingered in the public imagination. The Symbionese Liberation Army had kidnapped Patty Hearst from her Berkeley apartment in February. And in the spring, the Zebra killings, a series of racially motivated murders that would eventually claim 15 lives, were dominating the front pages and consuming the resources of the homicide department. The murders of 3 gay men on the margins of the city were, in that context, barely visible. The San Francisco Chronicle had not yet published a single story about the connected killings. The mainstream press was largely silent. The story existed only in the gay press, the San Francisco Sentinel and the Advocate, where reporters were doing extraordinary work with almost no institutional support. By the end of the summer of 1974, 3 men were dead, the killer had not been identified, and no one outside the gay community appeared to be paying serious attention. And then, for 10 months, the killing stopped. In the spring of 1975, the Doodler returned. On the 27th of April, Warren Andrews was found unconscious at Land's End, a rocky, brush-covered stretch of coastline just north of Ocean Beach, known for its winding trails and its reputation as a place where gay men met in private. Andrews was 52 years old. He was a lawyer who worked for the United States Postal Service. He had been severely beaten with a rock and a tree branch. He never regained consciousness. He died 7 weeks later in hospital without ever waking. His death was not connected to the earlier killings at the time. The method was different, blunt force rather than a knife, and investigators initially treated it as a separate case. It would take nearly 50 years, until January of 2022, for the San Francisco Police Department to publicly identify Andrews as a probable 6th victim of the Doodler. The working theory is that the killer's knife was lost or thrown during the struggle. Andrews had fought back hard, and that the rock and branch became weapons of necessity. Andrews' sister had never heard of the Doodler until investigators contacted her in 2021. 2 weeks after the attack on Andrews, on the 12th of May, a hiker found another body in the sand dunes behind Ocean Beach, between Vicent and Aloha Streets. Frederick Elmer Capin was 32 years old. He was a registered nurse who worked at St. Joseph's Hospital. Before that, he had served as a Navy corpsman in Vietnam, attached to a Marine unit. During one engagement, his unit walked into an ambush and 4 Marines were wounded beyond the line of fire. Capin crawled out under enemy gunfire, treated all 4 men, and held his position until they could be evacuated by helicopter. During the action, a Marine's weapon accidentally discharged and shattered a bone in Capin's leg. He received the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with valor for his actions. He was also a talented artist who had his paintings on display in bars near his home. In the winter before his death, Capin's family had asked to come visit him in San Francisco. He told them not to come. It was getting too dangerous, he said. He was planning to move back to Washington State. He never made it. His body was found wearing a blue corduroy jacket, a multicolored shirt, blue jeans, and brown shoes. His jacket and shirt were soaked through with blood. He had been stabbed 16 times, with the fatal wound striking his aorta. Disturbances in the sand indicated that his body had been dragged approximately 20 feet after he fell. He was identified through his fingerprints, which were on file with the state because of his nursing license. Less than a month later, on the 4th of June, a hiker on the Lincoln Park golf course noticed something 10 yards off the trail, partially hidden under brush. Harold Gulberg was 66 years old. He was a Swedish immigrant, a former sailor who had spent decades moving between ports across the world: Boston, Shanghai, Melbourne, Yokohama, Liverpool. He had become a naturalized American citizen in 1955. He had never married and had no known family in the area. He was tattooed on both arms. He had been dead for approximately 2 weeks. His body was badly decomposed. His pants were unzipped and his underwear had been taken, a detail that set his case slightly apart from the others. A handkerchief appeared to have been left behind by his killer. Gulberg was the oldest of the victims by more than a decade, and the condition of his body made forensic analysis difficult. He was initially listed as John Doe number 81. By the summer of 1975, the pattern had become unmistakable to anyone willing to look at it directly. 6 men, all white, all male, all gay or strongly suspected to be, found dead or dying in the same narrow band of coastline and parkland along San Francisco's western edge. Stabbed in the front and the back in similar locations, found in places associated with gay cruising, found alone with no witnesses and almost no physical evidence. And by this time, a name was circulating through the Castro's bar scene. Bartenders were telling their regulars. Regulars were warning their friends. The word was spreading in the way it always spread in a community that could not rely on the police to keep it informed. There was a man, young, black, tall, and slim. He came into the bars alone and sat in a corner with a drink. He carried a pen or a pencil and would sketch pictures, animals, cartoons, and sometimes the faces of the men sitting near him. He would approach a man, show him the drawing, and use it as a way in. It was flattering, charming, disarming. The man said he was studying commercial art. The men who left with him did not come back. The community was warning itself, but the warnings could only do so much because the places where the Doodler hunted were the same places where men went specifically to escape the world's attention, places where secrecy was the point, where being seen was the one thing no one wanted. The very thing that made those encounters possible was the same thing that made the victims vulnerable, and the Doodler knew it. By the middle of 1975, the homicide department had a set of linked cases with thin evidence, no suspects, and crime scenes that were over a year old. These were the kind of cases that veteran detectives called round necks, unsolvable puzzles that got hung on new investigators as a form of hazing. The department assigned them to inspectors Rhodia Gilford and Earl Sanders. It was not a punishment. Gilford and Sanders had built a reputation for solving exactly this kind of case, the ones no one else could crack. Rhodia Gilford was the first black inspector in any department of the San Francisco Police Department, promoted in 1964. He wore rimmed glasses, three-piece suits with matching ties, and carried himself with the bearing of a man who understood that every room he entered was watching him more closely than it watched anyone else. He had been on Martin Luther King Jr.'s security detail every time King visited the city. He was deeply embedded in his community, coaching baseball, raising money for local causes, knowing the names and faces of people on every block. When Gilford was promoted to homicide inspector in 1971, he was allowed to choose his own partner. He chose Earl Sanders, a 33-year-old patrolman he had been mentoring since Sanders joined the force. Sanders became the second black homicide inspector in the department's history. Sanders was built differently, stocky, muscular, a bulldog where Gilford was a diplomat. He wore a blazer and a fedora that matched his suit. Former colleagues described him as forceful, direct, and not someone you wanted to cross. Together, the two men were opposites who complemented each other perfectly. On their first day in the homicide unit, they were not given a desk. They had to haul one themselves from an unoccupied office to the fourth floor of the Hall of Justice. The message was clear. The department was, as Sanders would later describe it, an Irish old boys' club, and the two of them were not part of it. They succeeded anyway. Their method was not forensic science or bureaucratic procedure. It was relationships. Gilford and Sanders knew people on the street, informants, shopkeepers, barbers, shoeshine men. People told them things they would never tell white officers, because Gilford and Sanders treated everyone with respect regardless of who they were. They did not bust people for minor offenses. They did not leverage arrests to build goodwill. They simply talked to people, remembered what they heard, and followed where it led. They had helped crack the zebra killings in May of 1974, one of the most complex and politically charged investigations in the city's history. Their track record for clearing homicides was among the best in the department. But the Doodler case presented a problem they had not encountered before. The victims were gay men, found in places associated with gay cruising, killed by someone they had apparently met in gay bars. To build leads, Gilford and Sanders needed access to a community that had every reason to distrust anyone carrying a badge. They went in anyway. They visited the bars on Polk Street, in the Tenderloin and in the Castro. They talked to bartenders, managers, and regulars. They listened to rumors. They did not raid, did not arrest, did not threaten. They simply showed up, dressed immaculately, introduced themselves politely, and asked questions. It was not easy. When two men in suits walked into a gay bar in 1975, the first assumption was always that it was a raid. Patrons tensed, conversations went quiet. Gilford's charm and patience helped. He was, as one witness described him, a smooth cookie who could make people talk. Sanders was harder to introduce, but over time, the two of them built enough trust to access the information that was circulating beneath the surface. The bartenders knew things, one in particular, Wayne Friday, at the New Bell Saloon on Polk Street. A man who had his ear to every rumor in the neighborhood had heard the stories. A young man who doodled on napkins and showed his victims the drawings as a way of introducing himself, who flattered them, charmed them, and then suggested they go somewhere private. It was Wayne Friday, or someone very like him, who gave the killer his name. No one alive has taken definitive credit for coining it. It may have been a bartender, a detective, or a newspaper editor looking for a headline, but by the end of 1975, the name the Doodler had stuck. In November of 1975, nearly 2 years after the first murder, the SFPD released a composite sketch to the public. It appeared first in the Sentinel, the city's gay newspaper, and later in the San Francisco Chronicle. The suspect was described as a black man between 19 and 22 years old, between 5'10" and 6 feet tall, slim build. A narrow face with high-set cheekbones and wide-set eyes that witnesses described as calm. He frequently wore a dark navy-style watch cap. Police believed he had a quiet, serious personality, an above-average intelligence, and what they described as an upper-middle-class education. He had told at least one person that he was studying commercial art. They also believed he had a history of mental difficulties involving sex, what one newspaper described as sexual identification problems, and that he was receiving psychiatric care on an outpatient basis. The sketch was circulated, tips came in, suspects were questioned. One man who resembled the composite was taken into custody after he entered a Tenderloin bar and offered to draw the patrons. He was carrying a book of sketches and a butcher knife. He was booked for carrying a concealed weapon and, after attacking homicide inspectors during interrogation, charged with aggravated assault. He was not the Doodler. Gilford told the press that the man was one of the many suspects being checked. The real break in the case would not come from the streets or the bars. It would come from 3 men who had encountered the Doodler face to face and survived. By the summer of 1975, the Doodler had begun to make mistakes. He was leaving people alive. The details of the surviving attacks are incomplete. The victims themselves have never spoken publicly, and the police have released only fragments over the decades. But what is known, pieced together from press accounts and investigative reporting, reveals 3 separate encounters in which the Doodler attacked and failed to kill. The first survivor met the Doodler at 2 in the morning, as a bar was closing for the night. The group migrated to a late-night diner called the Truck Stop, as was common after last call. The man never gave his name, but the survivor invited him back to his apartment. Once inside, the Doodler locked himself in the bathroom for a long time. When he finally emerged, he attacked from behind, stabbing the man repeatedly. The knife broke during the assault, and the Doodler fled, leaving his victim alive. 2 weeks later, the Doodler returned to the same apartment building. Whether he was attempting to finish what he had started or seeking a new victim is unclear. He convinced another resident to let him inside under the pretense of using the telephone. Once in, he bound the man's hands and feet. But the victim fought back, yelling and banging loudly enough to attract building security. The Doodler escaped through the commotion. In both encounters, witnesses reported that the man repeated the same phrase, "You guys are all alike." The third surviving victim met the Doodler at a bar and brought him home. Once they were in the bedroom, a concealed knife dropped from the sleeve of the Doodler's jacket. The victim escaped unharmed and the Doodler fled. All three survivors were terrified. All three wanted to remain anonymous, but all three approached the police with whatever cooperation they could offer without exposing their identities publicly. With their descriptions, investigators were able to refine the composite sketch that had already been circulated. The physical details aligned: a young black man, tall and slim, with a narrow face and calm, wide-set eyes. The man who had charmed his way into bars across the Castro, Polk Street, and the Tenderloin. But what made these survivors significant was not just what they had seen, it was who they were. One was a European diplomat, a member of the Swedish diplomatic corps assigned to the United States. He had met the suspect in an upper market restaurant around midnight, where the man asked if he had any cocaine. They returned to the diplomat's apartment, where the suspect stabbed him 6 times. The diplomat survived and provided police with an accurate description. Another was described in press accounts only as a nationally known entertainer, a figure of sufficient public prominence that his name, had it been published, would have been immediately recognized. The third was described as a well-known San Francisco figure who, after the attacks, left the city entirely and reportedly would not answer letters or phone calls from investigators. All 3 men identified the same suspect in a police lineup, and all 3 refused to testify in court. The reason was simple, and it was devastating. To testify meant to appear publicly, under their real names, in a trial that would be covered by the press. A trial about the murder of gay men, in which the witness would have to explain why he was in a late-night restaurant, or a bar in the Castro, or an apartment with a man he had just met. A trial that would make explicit what each of these men had spent their entire public lives concealing. The diplomat would have been recalled. His career, possibly his life, would have been destroyed by the association. In the Sweden of 1975, homosexuality had only been decriminalized 5 years earlier. In the United States, where he was stationed, it remained a criminal offense in most jurisdictions. The entertainer, whoever he was, would have seen his career end overnight. The entertainment industry of the 1970s was not a place where an openly gay man could survive, let alone thrive. The closet was not a preference, it was a professional requirement. The third man simply disappeared without a word. Harvey Milk was asked about the case in 1977, by which point the suspect had been identified, interviewed, and released. Milk, who would be elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors 4 months later and assassinated the year after that, chose his words carefully. "I understand their position," he said. "I respect the pressure society has put on them." He elaborated that the men likely feared damage to their relationships, their families, and their careers. He estimated that 20 to 25% of the 85,000 gay men in San Francisco were still closeted. The survivors, he implied, were among them men who had built lives predicated on a secret, and for whom the exposure of that secret represented a form of destruction they were not willing to accept, even to put a killer behind bars. The police were left with a suspect they could not charge, witnesses who would not speak, and a case that had, in legal terms, nowhere to go. And it was at this point that the investigation took its strangest turn. In late 1975, a psychologist contacted the San Francisco Police Department. His secretary had actually called several times before anyone took her seriously. But when the message finally reached the homicide unit, what the psychologist had to say changed the shape of the investigation entirely. He told investigators that he had a patient, a young man, who had confessed to the killings during therapy sessions. The man matched the composite sketch. He had admitted to struggling with his own sexual identity, and the psychologist believed he posed an imminent and ongoing threat to the public. Under normal circumstances, this information would have been untouchable. Doctor-patient confidentiality was, and remains, one of the most protected boundaries in American law. A therapist cannot simply hand a patient's name to the police because he suspects wrongdoing. But in 1975, an amendment to California's patient privacy laws had created a narrow exception. If a psychologist believed that a patient represented a serious and imminent danger to others, the law permitted, some argued required, disclosure to the appropriate authorities. The psychologist invoked that exception and gave the police his patient's name. The suspect was brought in for questioning. What followed was, by all accounts, a cooperative interview. The man did not lawyer up. He did not refuse to speak. He sat with inspectors and talked freely, answering their questions with what was described as a calm and open demeanor. He admitted that he had been in therapy. He admitted that he had struggled with his sexuality. He told investigators that he had discussed these struggles with his psychologist. But he denied any involvement in the murders. He denied ever having harmed anyone. He said that whatever his psychologist believed he had heard, it was not a confession. He told the police that he had a girlfriend now and was feeling much better. The inspectors watched him. They assessed him. They compared what they knew about the killer, the physical description, the age range, the art background, the sexual confusion, to the man sitting in front of them. Gilford and Sanders and the other investigators who had spent months working the case came to a conclusion. They believed he was the Doodler. The police would later state publicly that they were fairly certain the man in question was responsible for the crimes. Rhodia Gilford told the press that the suspect had been questioned repeatedly over the course of more than a year and had talked freely each time. The San Francisco Sentinel reported that police knew his car's license plate number, knew where he lived, and had spoken to his treating psychologist at length. The psychologist had told investigators that the man admitted during one session that he had committed the brutal slayings. But none of it mattered, not legally. A confession made during a therapy session was not admissible in court. The psychologist's testimony about what his patient had said was hearsay, useful for building an investigation but worthless in front of a jury without corroboration. The only corroboration that existed was the testimony of the 3 surviving victims. 3 men who had seen the suspect's face, who had been in the same room with him, who had picked him out of a lineup. 3 men who would not take the stand. Without their testimony, the district attorney had nothing to prosecute with. The physical evidence from the crime scenes, collected from outdoor locations, exposed to weather, processed with the limited forensic tools of the 1970s, was insufficient to establish identity. The suspect's own statements to police contained no admissions. The case was, in legal terms, a closed door with the key visible on the other side of the glass. The suspect was released. He was watched from a distance for some time. He was re-interviewed on at least one subsequent occasion. At no point did he confess. At no point did the surviving witnesses change their minds about testifying, and at no point did the killings resume. Whether this was because the suspect knew he was being watched, or because the therapeutic intervention had altered his behavior, or because the police had the wrong man entirely, no one can say with certainty. What can be said is this: after the summer of 1975, no more bodies were found on the beaches and in the parks of San Francisco's western edge. The pattern that had held for 18 months, the stabbings, the rage, the bodies left in the sand, simply stopped. The last known article to cover the case in its immediate aftermath appeared in the Crusader, a gay newspaper, on the 16th of August, 1978. The headline read, "Police are nowhere on Doodler killings." The writer raged against the inaction of the department and predicted, with grim certainty, that the killer would strike again. He was wrong about that as far as anyone knows. But he was right about everything else. The police were nowhere. The case was nowhere. The suspect walked free, and the bodies of 6 men remained in the ground without anyone having answered for what had been done to them. The Doodler case did not end, it simply went quiet. For decades, it existed in a kind of institutional limbo, officially open, practically dormant. The police files remained active. The case was never closed, but no new charges were filed, no new suspects emerged, and the public heard almost nothing. The San Francisco Chronicle, which had largely ignored the killings while they were happening, did not revisit the case in any meaningful way for nearly 40 years. The story survived in fragments, a line in Armistead Maupin's 1978 novel Tales of the City, which mentioned the Doodler, a sinister black man who sat at the bar and sketched your face before taking you home to murder you. A brief item in the Weekly World News in 1999, a few sentences in encyclopedias of unsolved crime. The gay community that had lived through the killings moved on, not by choice, but by necessity. Within 4 years of the last murder, the first cases of what would become known as AIDS began appearing in San Francisco. The epidemic that followed would kill tens of thousands of men in the same neighborhoods where the Doodler had hunted. 5 unsolved stabbings became, relative to the scale of what came next, a statistical footnote. Harvey Milk was assassinated in November of 1978, shot by a fellow city supervisor in the hallway of San Francisco's City Hall. The man who had publicly defended the survivors' right to stay silent, who had understood, perhaps better than anyone, the cost of exposure, was gone. Rhodia Gilford retired from the SFPD and remained involved in his community until his death. Earl Sanders continued to rise through the department, eventually becoming the first black chief of police in San Francisco's history. Neither man ever solved the case that had defined a significant portion of their partnership. The suspect was never named publicly, he was never charged, and according to multiple sources, including the San Francisco Police Department itself, he remained in the Bay Area. For decades, that was where things stood. Then in 2018, everything shifted. The arrest of the Golden State Killer, identified through forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that had not existed during the original investigation, sent a shockwave through cold case units across the country. If a 40-year-old serial murder case could be cracked through DNA uploaded to a public genealogy database, then anything was possible. The San Francisco Police Department assigned Inspector Dan Cunningham to the Doodler case as part of a reinvigorated cold case unit. Cunningham began re-examining the evidence with modern tools and fresh eyes. In February of 2019, the department released an age-progressed sketch of the suspect, an image showing what the young man from the 1975 composite might look like more than 4 decades later, now estimated to be in his mid-60s to early 70s. They offered a reward of $100,000 for information leading to an arrest. The department announced that it would consider forensic genetic genealogy as an investigative tool. 2 DNA samples had been submitted for comparison, though as of public reporting, no match had been confirmed. In January of 2022, the police made another announcement. A 6th victim had been formally linked to the Doodler, Warren Andrews, the lawyer found beaten at Land's End in April of 1975, who had died 7 weeks later without regaining consciousness. His case had never previously been connected to the series because the method of killing differed. But the victimology and the location aligned, and investigators now believed the Doodler's knife had been lost during the struggle, forcing him to use whatever was at hand. The reward was doubled to $200,000. By 2023, it had been raised again to $250,000. The department also confirmed that the original suspect, the man identified by the psychologist, the man picked out of a lineup by 3 survivors, the man questioned repeatedly in the 1970s, had been re-interviewed in recent years. Reports indicated that during one of these more recent encounters, the suspect inadvertently left behind a DNA sample. Whether that sample has produced a usable result has not been disclosed. The SFPD's official position, repeated in every public statement, is that the case remains an active and ongoing investigation. They will not release the suspect's name. They will not confirm or deny whether he is still alive. They will not discuss the status of the DNA evidence. What is known from investigative journalism and public records is that the man police believe to be the Doodler is thought to be living freely in the Bay Area, more than 50 years after Gerald Kavanagh's body was found face-up in the sand on Ocean Beach. 6 men confirmed dead, as many as 16 suspected, 3 survivors who took their secret to their graves or who carry it still. A suspect who has never been arrested, never been tried, never been held to account. And a case that remains, in every legal and institutional sense, exactly where it was in 1977, a locked door with the key on the other side of the glass, visible but unreachable. The Doodler has never been caught, the Doodler has never been named, and the case has never been closed. That's the story of what happened in San Francisco. The victims, the timeline, the investigation that identified a suspect and then watched him walk free because the men who could have put him away were trapped inside the same closet that had made them vulnerable in the first place. But knowing what happened doesn't answer the deeper questions. Why did the killer sketch his victims before murdering them? What psychological need did that ritual serve? Why were the attacks described as rage killings, with 16 or 17 stab wounds, when the victims had gone with him willingly and without resistance? Why did he always kill outdoors, on beaches, in dunes, in parks, when he had been inside apartments and could have attacked there instead? And what does it mean that the very system designed to deliver justice, the courts, the trial process, the requirement of public testimony, became the mechanism that guaranteed the killer would never be held accountable? In part 2, we're going to look at what the Doodler's behavior reveals about the kind of mind that did this. What the ritual of the sketching tells us about how he related to his victims before he destroyed them. What the overkill tells us about the emotional state driving the violence. What his consistent choice of landscape reveals about the fantasy he was enacting. And why this case, more than 50 years later, remains one of the most psychologically unresolved crimes in American history. Of all the details in the Doodler case, the one that gave him his name is also the one that reveals the most about the structure of his mind. Before every killing, there was a drawing. The Doodler would enter a bar alone, sit in a corner with a drink, and begin sketching animals, cartoons, and eventually the faces of the men around him. At some point during the evening, he would approach a man, show him the portrait he had made, and use it as an opening. It was flattering, it was intimate, it suggested artistic sensitivity and focused attention. The man had been watching you, the man had been studying your face closely enough to reproduce it on a napkin. The man had chosen you. It worked again and again. Men left with him willingly, even eagerly. They drove him to the dunes themselves. They invited him into their apartments. They went with a stranger to isolated places in the middle of the night because the encounter that preceded it had felt personal, attentive, and safe. In criminal psychology, there is a distinction between what is called a blitz attack and what is called a con approach. A blitz attacker overwhelms his victim with sudden, unexpected violence. There is no interaction beforehand, no social exchange, no pretense of normalcy. The victim is ambushed. A con artist, in the criminal rather than the financial sense, gains access to his victim through social manipulation. He builds rapport, he creates trust. He makes the victim feel that whatever is happening is consensual, mutual, and chosen. By the time the violence begins, the victim has already been isolated from safety, often by his own willing participation. The Doodler was a con artist of extraordinary effectiveness. His method of approach, the sketching, was not simply a practical tool for initiating conversation. It was a performance of intimacy. It said without words that the encounter was personal rather than transactional, that the Doodler was interested in the man as an individual, not merely as a body. This is a critical distinction, because it tells us something about what the Doodler needed from the encounter before the violence began. A killer who uses a blitz approach needs nothing from his victim except access. The attack is the point. Everything that comes before it is merely logistics. A killer who uses a con approach needs something else, something that happens during the social interaction itself. The approach is not just a means to an end, it is part of the experience. For the Doodler, the sketching appears to have served this function. It was the opening act of a ritual that ended in murder, but it was not separate from the murder. It was the first movement of the same psychological event. In behavioral analysis, when a killer engages in a prolonged, ritualized interaction with his victim before the attack, it often suggests that the killer's fantasy involves a specific emotional sequence, not just the violence itself, but everything that leads up to it. The seduction, the trust, the intimacy, and then the destruction of all three. The sketch may have functioned as a form of psychological possession. By drawing the victim's face, the doodler was capturing something, taking ownership of the man's likeness, his attention, his interest. The victim became, in that moment, a subject, someone who existed in relation to the doodler's gaze, rendered on paper by the doodler's hand. What followed the departure from the bar, the drive to the beach, the walk into the dunes, was a continuation of that possession. The victim was being led step by step deeper into a space that the doodler controlled. Each step felt consensual. Each step was, in fact, a progressive narrowing of the victim's options, orchestrated by a man who knew exactly where the evening was going to end. There is one more detail about the sketching that deserves attention. No doodles were ever recovered from any of the crime scenes. No napkins with portraits were found on the bodies or in the sand nearby. Either the doodler took them with him, or they were lost to the elements. If he took them, that changes the interpretation significantly. A killer who removes something from the crime scene, particularly something he himself created during the encounter, may be taking a souvenir. In criminal psychology, souvenirs serve as memory anchors. They allow the killer to re-enter the experience after the fact, to relive the encounter through a physical object that connects him to the victim and to the emotional state he achieved during the crime. If the doodler kept the sketches, then each drawing was not merely a tool for luring the victim. It was a record, a portrait of a man in the last hour of his life, drawn by the hand that would end it. The intimacy of that act, looking at a man's face closely enough to reproduce it, speaking to him, sharing something creative with him, and then killing him, suggests a mind that did not experience the seduction and the violence as contradictory. They were part of the same event, the same night, the same fantasy. The sketch was not separate from the kill, it was the beginning of it. The police who found the bodies used the same phrase again and again: rage killings. Gerald Kavanagh was stabbed multiple times, front and back. Klaus Christman was stabbed at least 15 times and had his throat slashed in 3 places. Frederick Kappen received 16 stab wounds. The attacks were not efficient. They were not calculated to cause death in the quickest or quietest way possible. They were eruptions, sustained, repetitive, and far beyond what was necessary to end a life. In forensic psychology, this is called overkill. The term refers to violence that exceeds what is needed to accomplish the act of murder, and it is one of the most reliable indicators of the emotional state driving a crime. A killer who stabs someone once or twice in a vital area is operating with practical intent. He wants the person dead, and he achieves that goal with efficiency. The violence is instrumental, a means to an end. A killer who stabs someone 16 times, who slashes the throat after the fatal wound has already been delivered, who continues attacking the body long after resistance has ceased, that killer is not operating from practical intent. He is operating from something else entirely. Overkill almost always indicates that the violence is emotionally driven rather than instrumentally driven. The killer is not simply trying to end a life. He is expressing something, discharging an internal pressure that has been building long before the attack began, and that requires sustained, repetitive physical action to release. The question is what that pressure was and where it came from. In the Doodler's case, there is a detail that makes the overkill particularly revealing. Every one of his victims had gone with him willingly. There was no resistance at the point of initial contact, no struggle to gain access, no argument, no confrontation, no provocation. The men who died on Ocean Beach had spent the preceding hour or more in pleasant conversation with their killer. They had been flattered by him, charmed by him, drawn by him. They had driven him to the beach or walked with him into the dunes under the impression that they were going somewhere private to be intimate together. And then, within minutes of arriving at that private place, the Doodler attacked them with a level of fury that investigators described as among the most vicious they had ever encountered. This transition from calm social interaction to explosive violence is one of the defining features of what criminal psychologists call the angry retaliatory offender. The anger retaliatory killer is not motivated by sexual sadism, by the desire to control, or by financial gain. He is motivated by rage, specifically, rage that has been accumulating over time, and that is directed not at the individual victim, but at what the victim represents. The victim is a symbol, a stand-in. The rage belongs somewhere else, usually in the killer's past, usually connected to a person or a category of person who held power over him during a period of vulnerability. But because the original source of the rage cannot be confronted directly, the anger gets redirected onto people who resemble that source in some way. In the Doodler's case, the target category was consistent across every known attack: white gay men, men who were open enough about their sexuality to be in a gay bar, to flirt, to leave with a stranger, men who had, in some way, accepted what they were. The Doodler's psychologist told police that his patient was struggling with his own sexual identity. The suspect himself admitted during questioning that he had experienced confusion about his sexuality, though he insisted he had resolved it. The phrase he reportedly repeated to at least 2 of his surviving victims, "You guys are all alike," carries a weight that is difficult to miss. You guys, not us, you. The separation in that language is significant. The Doodler did not see himself as part of the community he was destroying. He saw himself as outside it, looking in, and what he saw provoked something in him that could only be resolved through extraordinary violence. One possible reading, and it is a reading consistent with both the behavioral evidence and the clinical details that emerged during the investigation, is that the Doodler was killing the thing in others that he could not accept in himself. The men he targeted were not random. They were gay men who had achieved some measure of peace with their identity. Men who went to bars openly, who flirted, who left with strangers without apparent shame. Men who had crossed a threshold that the Doodler, for whatever reason, could not cross. If the Doodler was, as his psychologist and the police believed, a man in profound conflict about his own sexuality, then the men he killed were not just victims. They were mirrors. They reflected back to him a version of himself that he experienced as intolerable, a version that was gay, that desired men, that acted on that desire without the paralyzing self-hatred that governed his own internal world. The overkill makes sense in this context. The rage was not about the individual man lying in the sand. It was about what that man represented, a freedom the Doodler could not access, a self-acceptance he could not achieve, an identity he could not reconcile with whatever framework of shame or hatred had been built around it during his formative years. 16 stab wounds is not the behavior of a man trying to kill a stranger. It is the behavior of a man trying to destroy something inside himself, using someone else's body as the site of that destruction. And the phrase, "you guys are all alike," suggests that he knew it. On some level, he understood that his victims were interchangeable. That it was never about Gerald Kavanagh or Yi Stevens or Klaus Christmann as individuals. It was about what they had in common. What they represented, what they reflected back to him every time he sat in a bar and sketched their faces and felt whatever it was he felt before the knife came out. The rage had an address, and that address was the part of himself he could not live with. Every confirmed victim of the Doodler was found outdoors. Ocean Beach, Spreckles Lake, Land's End, the Lincoln Park Golf Course, the sand dunes between Vicent and Aloha Streets. Not one body was discovered inside a building. Not one attack, as far as investigators can determine, was completed indoors. And yet the Doodler had access to indoor spaces. At least 2 of his surviving victims had brought him into their apartments. He had been inside private residences, behind locked doors, in spaces where the killing could have been carried out with far less risk of discovery. He did not kill there, he attacked, yes, in one case stabbing a man from behind before his knife broke, in another binding a man's hands before being interrupted. But the completed murders, the ones where the Doodler carried his violence through to its full expression, all took place outside, on sand, on grass, under open sky with the sound of the ocean or the wind moving through park trees. This is not a practical choice, it is a psychological one. Killing indoors is by every tactical measure safer. The walls contain sound, the door can be locked. There are no passers-by, no hikers walking their dogs at dawn, no joggers on an early morning run. The body can be concealed for hours or days, buying time for the killer to distance himself from the scene. Killing outdoors in public parks, on public beaches, in spaces where anyone could wander past at any moment is reckless. It increases the risk of discovery exponentially. It leaves the body exposed to the elements, which in some cases aids forensic analysis and in others destroys evidence, but which always guarantees that the victim will be found relatively quickly. The Doodler chose the more dangerous option every single time, and when he was inside an apartment, when the safer option was literally surrounding him, he either failed to complete the attack or chose not to. In behavioral analysis, when a killer consistently selects a high-risk environment over a low-risk one, and does so despite having access to both, the environment is almost certainly part of the fantasy rather than a logistical necessity. The killer does not simply need a place to commit the act, he needs a specific place. A place that provides something the fantasy requires, a sensory context, an emotional setting, a symbolic landscape that completes the internal scene he has been rehearsing long before the crime itself takes place. For the Doodler, that landscape was the edge of the city, the liminal space where San Francisco met the Pacific, where the sand dunes rose high enough to block the view from the road, where the surf was loud enough to swallow sound, where the darkness was total on a foggy night. These were places associated with secrecy, with the hidden lives of men who met there precisely because they could not meet anywhere else. The dunes and the trails and the overlooks were not just locations. They were symbols of the closeted existence that defined gay life in the 1970s, spaces carved out of the margins, beautiful and isolated and inherently dangerous. If the Doodler was, as the evidence suggests, a man in deep conflict about his own sexuality, then these locations may have carried a specific psychological charge for him. They were the places where the thing he hated about himself was enacted, where men did what men were not supposed to do with each other, in secret, in the dark, at the edge of the world. By bringing his victims to these places, or by allowing them to bring him there, the Doodler was returning to the site of his own conflict, the place where desire and shame met, the place where the thing he could not accept about himself became visible, physical, and therefore destroyable. The beach was not incidental to the crime. It was the stage on which the psychological drama could be performed. The wind, the sand, the roar of the ocean, the complete absence of witnesses, these were not just practical advantages. They were atmospheric requirements. And there is another dimension to this we should talk about. Every victim was found alone, left where he fell or dragged a short distance and abandoned. The Doodler did not bury his victims. He did not conceal them. He did not carry them to the water and let the tide take them, though the proximity to the ocean would have made that easy in several cases. Gerald Kavanagh was found at the water's edge, close enough that the tide had nearly carried him away, but the Doodler had not placed him there deliberately. He had simply left him. A killer who conceals his victims is usually motivated by self-preservation. He wants to delay discovery, buy time, avoid identification. A killer who leaves his victims in the open, visible, exposed, certain to be found, is either indifferent to consequences or is making a statement. In the Doodler's case, the lack of concealment may suggest something about how he experienced the aftermath of the crime. Once the violence was complete, once the rage had been discharged, the victim may have ceased to exist for him in any meaningful psychological sense. The man on the ground was no longer a person, no longer a mirror, no longer a source of intolerable reflection. He was simply inert matter, something left behind when the emotional event was over. The Doodler did not need to hide what he had done because, in the psychological sense, what he had done was already finished. The act was complete. The internal pressure had been released. Whatever the killing had provided, relief, discharge, temporary resolution of an unbearable conflict, had been achieved the moment the violence ended. What remained on the sand was irrelevant to him. He walked away and left the ocean to do whatever it would. There is a detail in this case that separates it from almost every other unsolved serial murder in American history. The police knew who did it. They had a suspect identified by 3 separate surviving victims. They had a confession reported by a treating psychologist. They had a man who matched the composite sketch, who matched the behavioral profile, who had been interviewed repeatedly, and who, by the department's own public admission, they were fairly certain was responsible for the crimes. And they could not touch him, not because the evidence was insufficient in the investigative sense. Not because they lacked probable cause, not because the suspect had fled the jurisdiction or destroyed the physical evidence or intimidated the witnesses into silence. They could not touch him because three men, three living, breathing men who had looked into the killer's face and survived, would not walk into a courtroom and say what they knew. The reason they would not testify was not cowardice, it was mathematics. In 1975, a gay man who testified publicly in a murder trial, a trial that would be covered by the press, that would name him in open court, that would require him to explain what he was doing in a gay bar at 2 in the morning, and why he had invited a stranger back to his apartment, faced a specific and quantifiable set of consequences. He would lose his career. In the case of the diplomat, he would be recalled and almost certainly expelled from the foreign service. In the case of the entertainer, he would be blacklisted from an industry that did not tolerate openly gay men in any visible role. In the case of the third man, whatever life he had built on the foundation of his public heterosexuality would collapse overnight. He might lose his family. In the 1970s, the revelation that a man was gay was, in many families, treated as equivalent to a death, a severance so complete that it carried the same emotional weight as bereavement. Parents disowned their children, wives filed for divorce, children were told their father was gone. He might lose his freedom. Sodomy remained a criminal offense in California until 1976, and in many other jurisdictions long after that. A man who admitted under oath to having sexual contact with another man was, in the strictest legal sense, confessing to a crime. And he would lose his privacy permanently. Once a name entered the public record in connection with a case like this, it could never be taken back. Every future employer, every future relationship, every future interaction with any institution, all of it would be shadowed by the association. The survivors calculated these costs and concluded that testifying would destroy their lives as thoroughly as the Doodler had tried to destroy their bodies. They chose the damage they could survive over the damage they could not. This is the mechanism by which the closet functioned as a weapon, not metaphorically, but operationally. The Doodler did not create the closet. He did not design the social system that made it impossible for gay men to acknowledge their sexuality without facing catastrophic consequences. He did not write the sodomy laws or set the department's hiring policies, or decide that the entertainment industry would blacklist anyone suspected of being homosexual. But he operated inside that system with what appears to have been an intuitive understanding of how it worked. He hunted in spaces defined by secrecy. He chose victims whose lives depended on remaining invisible. He attacked men who could not report what had happened to them without exposing the very thing they had spent their entire lives concealing. And when, against all odds, 3 of his victims survived and cooperated with the police, when the system came closer to holding him accountable than it had any right to, given the circumstances, the closet protected him anyway. Because the final step in the legal process required his victims to stand up in public and say who they were, and that was the one thing the system had made impossible. In criminal psychology, there is a concept called the vulnerability factor. It describes the characteristic that makes a particular victim attractive to a particular predator, the thing about them that the killer recognizes, consciously or unconsciously, as making them accessible, controllable, and unlikely to generate an effective response from the institutions meant to protect them. For the Doodler, the vulnerability factor was not physical weakness or social isolation in the conventional sense. His victims were, in many cases, educated, successful, socially connected men, a diplomat, an entertainer, a lawyer, a decorated war veteran. The vulnerability factor was the secret. Every man the Doodler killed or attacked was carrying a secret that made him fundamentally unable to seek help from the systems designed to provide it. The police were not safe. The courts were not safe. Public attention of any kind was not safe. The men he targeted were powerful in every way except the one that mattered. They were powerless to be seen. The Doodler hunted in that blind spot. He operated in the space between what these men were and what they could afford to be publicly. And the legal system, designed to deliver justice through public proceedings and open testimony, could not bridge that gap. Harvey Milk understood this. When he said, "I respect the pressure society has put on them," he was not offering a platitude. He was naming the mechanism. The pressure was not abstract, it was structural. It was a system of laws, customs, professional requirements, and family expectations that made the closet not a choice but a survival strategy. The Doodler did not defeat the justice system defeated itself. It was built on the assumption that victims could speak, and it confronted a case in which the very act of speaking carried consequences that the victims reasonably judged to be worse than the crime going unpunished. This is what makes the Doodler case unlike almost any other in the history of American criminal law. The failure was not investigative, the police did their job. The failure was not evidentiary, the identification was solid. The failure was architectural, built into the foundations of a society that had made an entire category of human experience unspeakable, and then demanded speech as the price of justice. The closet was not a side effect of the case. It was the murder weapon that kept working long after the knife had been put away. More than 50 years have passed since Gerald Kavanaugh's body was found on Ocean Beach. The suspect has never been named, he has never been charged. According to the best available information, he is still alive, an elderly man living somewhere in the Bay Area, carrying whatever he carries, known to the police but untouched by them. 6 men are confirmed dead, as many as 16 may have been killed. 3 survivors identified the same man and then retreated into silence. A psychologist heard a confession and reported it. Investigators built a case they believed in and watched it dissolve against the wall of an impossible legal requirement. And the case remains open, not in the symbolic sense that historians use when they say a mystery endures. Open in the literal institutional sense, an active file in the San Francisco Police Department's cold case unit, with investigators assigned, DNA evidence submitted, and a reward of $250,000 posted for information leading to an arrest. The Doodler case is not history, it is happening now. And that fact, the fact that the case exists in an active, unresolved present rather than a sealed and distant past, is what gives it a psychological weight that most cold cases do not carry. In psychology, there is a well-documented phenomenon called the Zeigarnik effect. It describes the tendency of the human mind to remember incomplete tasks and unresolved narratives far more vividly than completed ones. When a story reaches its conclusion, when the killer is named, the trial is held, the sentence is passed, the brain files it away. The emotional tension dissolves because there is nothing left to resolve. The system closes. But when a narrative remains unfinished, when the answer exists but cannot be spoken, when the suspect is known but cannot be charged, when the case is open but cannot move forward, the brain keeps it active. It stays in a loop, cycling through the available information, searching for the resolution it cannot find. The Doodler case is one of the most perfect examples of an unresolvable open loop in the history of American crime. It is not unresolved because the evidence is missing. It is unresolved because the evidence exists and cannot be used. The door is not locked because the key has been lost. The door is locked because the key is visible on the other side of the glass and no one can reach it. This is a fundamentally different kind of frustration than the one produced by a case where the killer is truly unknown. In those cases, the Zodiac, Jack the Ripper, the Texarkana Phantom, the open loop is powered by mystery. The question is who. The brain churns through possibilities, examines suspects, weighs theories, and the absence of a definitive answer keeps the loop spinning. In the Doodler case, the question is not who. The police believe they know who. The survivors believed they knew who. The psychologist knew his patient's name. The loop is not powered by mystery. It is powered by injustice. The brain is not searching for an answer. It is searching for a resolution that the system has declared impossible. It is grinding against the knowledge that the answer exists and that it will not be delivered, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the world in which the crime took place was structured in a way that made justice architecturally unachievable. This is a far more destabilizing form of cognitive unrest than simple mystery. Mystery at least carries the possibility of future resolution, a new witness, a deathbed confession, a breakthrough in forensic technology. The Doodler case carries that possibility too, in theory. DNA evidence is being tested. Forensic genealogy is being considered. The suspect may yet be identified publicly. But the deeper injustice, the one that defines the case psychologically, cannot be repaired by a DNA match. Even if the Doodler is named tomorrow, even if he is arrested and tried and convicted, the fundamental shape of what happened cannot be altered. 6 men died because they were gay and vulnerable in a city that refused to protect them. 3 men survived and could not seek justice because the act of seeking it would have destroyed them. A killer walked free not because the system failed to find him, but because the system was designed in a way that made finding him irrelevant. That is not a wrong that a conviction can make right. It is a structural failure, a failure of the society that produced both the killer and the conditions that shielded him. And structural failures do not resolve in the way that individual crimes resolve. They persist, they echo, they leave behind a residue that no verdict can wash away. There is one more psychological dimension to this case that distinguishes it from other unsolved murders, and it has to do with the nature of the victim's erasure. When a serial killer is caught and convicted, the victim's stories are, in some sense, completed. They become part of a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Their deaths are contextualized, their suffering is acknowledged. They are given a place in the public record that says this happened, this was wrong, and this was answered. When a case remains open, the victims remain in a state of partial erasure. Their deaths have not been officially attributed to anyone. Their suffering has not been formally recognized by the institution empowered to recognize it, the criminal justice system. They exist in a liminal space between acknowledged and forgotten, named but not avenged. In the Doodler case, this erasure is compounded by the erasure that defined the victims' lives. Gerald Kavanagh was listed as John Doe number 7. Klaus Christman was unidentified for weeks. Harold Goldberg was John Doe number 81. Even in death, these men remained partially invisible, unclaimed, unnamed, separated from the communities and families that might have mourned them openly if the world had been structured differently. The case cannot close because closing it would require the world to be something it was not in 1975, and something it has not yet fully become. A place where a gay man's life is valued equally in the eyes of the law, where his death is investigated with the same urgency as anyone else's, and where the systems meant to protect him do not require his self-destruction as the price of their participation. The Doodler case is not merely an unsolved crime. It is an indictment that has been sitting on a desk for 50 years, waiting for a system capable of hearing it, and the system has not yet arrived. And that fact, the fact that the case exists in an active, unresolved present rather than a sealed and distant past, is what gives it a psychological weight that most cold cases do not carry. In psychology, there is a well-documented phenomenon called the Zeigarnik effect. It describes the tendency of the human mind to remember incomplete tasks and unresolved narratives far more vividly than completed ones. When a story reaches its conclusion, when the killer is named, the trial is held, the sentence is passed, the brain files it away. The emotional tension dissolves because there is nothing left to resolve. The system closes. But when a narrative remains unfinished, when the answer exists but cannot be spoken, when the suspect is known but cannot be charged, when the case is open but cannot move forward, the brain keeps it active. It stays in a loop, cycling through the available information, searching for the resolution it cannot find. The Doodler case is one of the most perfect examples of an unresolvable open loop in the history of American crime. It is not unresolved because the evidence is missing. It is unresolved because the evidence exists and cannot be used. The door is not locked because the key has been lost. The door is locked because the key is visible on the other side of the glass and no one can reach it. This is a fundamentally different kind of frustration than the one produced by a case where the killer is truly unknown. In those cases, the Zodiac, Jack the Ripper, the Texarkana Phantom, the open loop is powered by mystery. The question is who. The brain churns through possibilities, examines suspects, weighs theories, and the absence of a definitive answer keeps the loop spinning. In the Doodler case, the question is not who. The police believe they know who. The survivors believed they knew who. The psychologist knew his patient's name. The loop is not powered by mystery. It is powered by injustice. The brain is not searching for an answer. It is searching for a resolution that the system has declared impossible. It is grinding against the knowledge that the answer exists and that it will not be delivered, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the world in which the crime took place was structured in a way that made justice architecturally unachievable. This is a far more destabilizing form of cognitive unrest than simple mystery. Mystery at least carries the possibility of future resolution, a new witness, a deathbed confession, a breakthrough in forensic technology. The Doodler case carries that possibility too, in theory. DNA evidence is being tested. Forensic genealogy is being considered. The suspect may yet be identified publicly. But the deeper injustice, the one that defines the case psychologically, cannot be repaired by a DNA match. Even if the Doodler is named tomorrow, even if he is arrested and tried and convicted, the fundamental shape of what happened cannot be altered. 6 men died because they were gay and vulnerable in a city that refused to protect them. 3 men survived and could not seek justice because the act of seeking it would have destroyed them. If you've made it this far, I'm curious. Do you think the suspect the police identified in the 1970s is the Doodler? Do you think forensic genealogy will finally put a name to the composite sketch? Do you think the man is still alive, somewhere in the Bay Area, watching the reward climb higher with each passing year? Or do you think about the 3 men who survived, who looked into the killer's face and chose silence, because the world they lived in made silence the only rational option? Leave a comment and let me know, but for now, have a good rest and see you next time.